Hello, and welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. It is our desire to present to the 21st century person the faith of the first century Christians. We seek unity through the acceptance of the faith that was once and for all time delivered unto the saints, a system of faith which first began to be spoken by our Lord prior to his crucifixion, and was later confirmed to the saints by the apostles and inspired writers of the New Testament. Thus a faith from yesterday to today and into forever. Our speaker is Brian Barrett, who preaches for the church at Bear Branch, in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We encourage all persons interested in the faith of our fathers to open their Bibles, as we search the Scriptures, for these eternal truths, which can lead Christians back into unity as the family of God. Now, here is Brian.
This morning from the book of John, chapter 18, verse 15. John, chapter 18, verse 15. As we left off last Lord's Day, we had seen the arrest of Jesus and how that we're told that the band led him away, verse 13, to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. And as we continue down in verse 15 this morning, it says, "And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out the other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then said the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art thou also one of this man's disciples? He said, I am not. And the servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples, of his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spake openly in the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whether the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me? And Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. And Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, Art thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. And one of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, said, Did not I see thee in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crowed. I'm just going to stop there. We may go a little further and get a little further, but we'll stop with that reading, just get an idea. When Jesus was arrested, his disciples were scattered and went in various directions, as we read through some of the other accounts. And we're told that in verse 15 that Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. When we look at this verse, we see that Peter, and here it just says another disciple, and that's a phrase that many times the writer uses of himself rather than identifying himself. He just uses a term, another disciple. That is another disciple besides Peter, not necessarily another disciple besides John. But Peter and another disciple followed at a distance. And one of the things that we see is that the disciple that was with Peter was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. This is an interesting kind of discussion because, again, though he doesn't specifically identify himself, one wonders how exactly that someone who was a disciple of Jesus came to be known by the high priest or was known of him. And the idea there is again, there is a more friendly, familiar kind of knowledge one of another. And for the high priest to have known this individual well enough that he actually had access into his home or into his palace, and he was not hindered. And that's an interesting discussion, and we could go into a lot of different aspects of that. For many, they believe that this is John, and that John was known and did know the high priest. And of course, that's an interesting question as to why he would have known the high priest, and why he would have been known to such a degree that he could just walk in basically to the palace. Peter stayed without, but John could just walk in, or this disciple could just walk in and follow Jesus as they took him in, and nobody seems to have hindered him. And the reason being for that is that he was known of the high priest. And of course, that raises certain questions as to who exactly this disciple was, what tribe of Israel they may have been a part of. We know that Peter and Andrew and James and John are said to have been fishermen by trade. That's one of the ways that they made a living. But some have speculated that whoever this other disciple was, if they were part of the priestly family, if they were part of the Levitical family, that would mean that they had served or were at least capable of serving in the temple, in which case they would have most certainly been known by the high priest, the priests that were ministering in the temple. And of course, the fact that they were fishermen doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't and didn't have this disciple the obligation. Of course, the obligation of the priest to minister in the temple that time was only 2 weeks out of the year. And so those weren't even consecutive weeks. And so there was, about 24 courses of priests, and each one of those courses served twice in a year's time. And so that's 50 weeks or 48 weeks, depending on which kind of calendar you're using, that they weren't busy in the temple ministering to the things of God. And so they'd have to have some other type of occupation or something to keep them busy with, which most certainly being a fisherman and being in business for yourself, and some of those again, are interesting concepts. I don't know, to what extent this plays out, but it's just an interesting thing that the high priest, who is working with the Sanhedrin council and generally busy with the affairs of state as it applies to the people of Israel, that that high priest would be friendly to the extent that, again, someone can just kind of come and go. And as we see here, he was in there where Jesus was. And again, we're told that he went and spoke to the damsel, or the one who was in charge of the door. And here again, it's how you get in or out of the palace. You know, if she knows who you are, or you have a reason to be there, she'll let you in. If you don't have a reason, she's not going to unlock the door. And, you know, we're kind of busy right now. You know, come back later. And so John goes back to her, or this other disciple, as it may be, and he tells the damsel that Peter is outside, and he basically asks her to bring Peter in. And so this sets up an interesting circumstance. Many times people look at something from different perspectives. And so by looking from the different perspectives, we come up with a different meaning to events and circumstances. And this is one of those where we need to be careful. It teaches us something. John asks the damsel to go out and find Peter and bring him in, let him in also. Apparently Peter wasn't as well known among them as this disciple was. And so she goes out looking for Peter, and she asks him if he is Peter. Now, you got to understand, we turn and look at the other perspective. Peter's standing out there warming himself around some of the coals that they have out there, and some of the soldiers keeping themselves warm. This woman comes out of the place where Jesus has been arrested, and she comes down asking, "Are you Simon Peter?" Now, she doesn't at this time explain why she's looking for him. He doesn't know that the other disciple has managed to get him access so he can be in there with Jesus. And so he doesn't know what she's wanting to know, if he's Peter, why she wants to know that. And so he assumes that, you know, he's standing there with some of the soldiers and guards and all. I mean, all she has to do, if he says yes, is tell them arrest him too and bring him in. He doesn't know what's happened to John. You know, John was allowed in there. He doesn't know what's going on with Jesus. And so he kind of panics. He doesn't know, you know, what's going on. So he denies, you know, no, I'm not him. And so here, from different perspectives, we see sometimes why we, again, need to look at a circumstance, in depth, not just judge by appearance sake. By Peter's appearance, as he was witnessing it, he felt that he might be about to be arrested. But from John's perspective, he was just giving him an opportunity to see what was going on with Jesus. And so, she went out to bring him in and asked, "Art not thou one of this man's disciples?" He said, "I am not." And of course, that constitutes the first denial that Jesus has told him about. And in verse 18, the servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold. Now remember, we're talking about March or April of the year, and so it's just beginning to warm up, and so it's night, and it's probably late into the night by this time. And so it's cold out there, and Peter's cold, and so he's warming himself with those who are around the fire. And again, the servants and officers who made the fire there with Peter, and again, the high priest is inside. We're kind of getting two things going on here at the same time, but in verse 19, the high priest then, he's asking Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Why are you creating this band of disciples? What are your purposes? Ask him about his disciples, and he starts asking him about his doctrine and to explain himself. And Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whether the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. And so, he's telling the high priest that everything is pretty much transparent as far as his doctrine is concerned and of his teachings. You can ask just about anybody who heard him. And that's why I say that when Matthew records Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, he's giving us an introduction as well as kind of rounding out an understanding of the types of things that Jesus taught about life and lifestyles. And with the parables and other things that are recorded, we get a pretty good idea that Jesus was concerned about the coming of the kingdom, and he spoke many parables about the coming of the kingdom. And he also taught doctrines such as we see in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And so, again, he wants to know, verse 21, why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I've said. Reasonable. Jesus has been arrested, and so from a general standpoint, somebody who's been arrested will say just about anything to get off so that they don't end up going to jail. Now, that's not necessarily the case with Jesus, but if you watch any of the crime shows and murder mysteries and all that, you'll know that people many times are innocent. Very seldom do guilty people ever go to prison. Everybody pleads their innocence. Now, occasionally, somebody will man up or woman up and admit to what they've done, but most people say, well, I'm innocent, and they will, again, redraw history to make themselves look good. And really what Jesus was saying to the high priest is, you don't have to ask me, and why would you take my word for it by itself? He says, why don't you ask some of the people who've heard me teach? He did not forbid people to be around him. Matter of fact, multitudes of people were around him every time he went into the temple, when he went from city to city, the synagogues, all that, people were around him constantly. And as we've seen so far, generally speaking, it seems as if the religious leaders that were there in Jerusalem had been sending spies to kind of keep an eye on him anyway. And of course, what says, when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? He asks you a question, and that's not the way to answer it. And of course, we see the beginning of the abusive nature of those who were in charge of Jesus. First, with the Jewish officers and those who were there with the high priest. And then later on, he will be abused again through and with the hands of the Romans and others. But you can see that people who are in places of authority and power, sometimes they aren't as kind as they could be, and they take everything personally. And so we have this officer who was standing there, who was watching Jesus, and he felt obligated to just give him a good slap with the palm of his hand and ask him, is that the way that you answer a question? It's ask you. And so at this time, he wasn't specifically commanded to do that. He just felt obligated. And so this officer may very well be some of those who were with the high priest at many times when they had discussed Jesus, and was again another person trying to impress the Jewish leadership, get a name for himself. I don't know what it all is, but he took the way in which Jesus spoke to him in a personal way, or took it upon himself to defend the high priest. And so, Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me? And of course, while he might not have liked the answer that Jesus gave, the answer that Jesus gave was a pretty simple, straightforward answer. And I would imagine that there were a lot of people standing by there who could have spoke on the subject of what Jesus had said and what he had taught and whom he had spoke with. And as we see, it's not like if John or whoever this other disciple was known by the high priest, then he should have known that he was a disciple of Jesus. Also, that disciple was a disciple of Jesus, and Peter and Andrew and James and John, the other 12, and especially Judas, they'd already been talking with him. And so, of course, we don't know what all Judas had to say necessarily. His primary function was just to betray Jesus and find him at a point, a place, and time that they could more or less arrest him without a great public controversy. Is there any questions or comments so far down through 23? John says in verse 24, Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. And so Jesus was passed around that night quite a bit. First, they took him to Annas, then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas. Through the night, he ends up with Pilate, and Pilate sends him to Herod. Herod sends him back to Pilate. He's passed around all night long. And again, in all of these different places, he is held in contempt. He's mocked, he's slapped, he's beaten. And so some who say, well, Jesus died pretty fast on the cross. He really didn't put up a good fight. Well, I don't know how far he had walked out of the city up the top of the Mount of Olives, and he was up all night long, and I don't know everything that he was doing the day preceding that, but Jesus went through a considerable bit physically as far as his travels and his moving about. He was up all night. He didn't get any sleep. And as I said, everybody who got a hold of him seems the Romans as well as the Jewish officers felt that, again, it was acceptable to slap and beat and mock and hold him, accountable for, again, everything that he said. Now, as we continue, then the other story about Simon, in verse 25, we're told, and Simon Peter stood and warmed himself there with the soldiers. They said, therefore, unto him, art not thou one of his disciples? And he denied it and said, I am not. And so we see that we have the second situation. And as we look at this and talking about Peter, in one of the situations, he's standing there warming himself around the fire. And again, people are having conversations, and I would think if he was standing there around the fire, people would want to know, the officers want to know who he is and talk with him and discuss things with him. And so in one place, the point comes up that even his speech betrayed him, that he was a Galilean. His accent was different from those in the southern area of Judea, and so his speech even betrayed him. And so he denies that he is one of the disciples. It's interesting, if you're not one of his disciples, and again, you're not one of us, what are you doing here in the middle of the night? I mean, I don't necessarily see that question being put forth, but it's an interesting question. How many people in the middle of the night just wander down to the palace, the place of the high priest, and just sort of stand out front with the soldiers and guards and just pass the time? He seems out of place. He's out of place to the soldiers. He's the damsel who is familiar, I'm sure, with some of the regular guards and people who were there around the palace. I mean, that's part of her job, to know who should be in and who shouldn't. And so she recognizes, that Peter is not one of the normal folk that have any purpose or reason for being there. And so she's addressed him. He denies that. The soldiers and those there addressed it, and he denied it again. And verse 26 says, one of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, said, did not I see thee in the garden with him? Now this person who's there also warming themselves happens to be a kinsman or a relative of the high priest's servant who Peter cut their ear off. And if you stand there and watch somebody try to hack your cousin or whoever he was in half with a sword, that kind of sticks in your mind a bit, seeing his ear cut off and all the things that happened. And of course Jesus healed him, and so he brings that up. You look pretty much like the guy who was there, and I don't know, again, everything, it doesn't say, but when you hack off somebody's ear, there's usually blood splatters and everything else. So I don't know if Peter had anything on his clothes or whatever, but there's a lot of interesting things that's going on there. And Peter denied again that he was there and that he was one of his disciples. And immediately we're told that the rooster, in essence, crowed. And so this becomes the fulfillment of that which Jesus had mentioned to him in the night which he was betrayed. And it just shows us that Jesus had knowledge of the events and things that were going to take place. Again, any questions or comments on the betrayal or the situation or the circumstance?
The rooster that crowed must be pretty close to the farm. It seemed the light, because they don't crow when it's dark.
Yeah. Well, again, by the time that we're looking at it, may already be coming toward morning.
Right.
They were up having the Last Supper, and then they went up into the garden and had prayer there. They walked all the way up there, and then they walked them all the way back. And he's already been to Annas. Now he's sent to Caiaphas, and so it's it may be getting kind of long in the night, but it is that may be right too. I mean, the rooster may have been around the fire or whatever. And of course, you never know. Somebody may have smacked it with the end of a spear to get it away from them. It would cause them to. But for, generally speaking, and again, it's been a while since I've been on the farm, but, my grandparents, I know that, the morning the rooster starts crowing, it's your alarm clock. And so it gives some insight into, a little bit of the time. And again, it's a very, very long night, very stressful night, lots of things that are going on. Verse 28, it says, Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So now, after all of this has transpired, the Jews have had, their shot at him, if you want to call it that night. And of course, if they are to bring their conspiracy to fruition, they have to get the Romans involved in it. And so they move him from what we would think of as Jewish custody to Roman custody. He's been arrested by Jewish officers of the temple. And so these guards have had him in custody a big portion of the evening, moving him around, abusing him. And now we have to move forward to get the authority, in essence, of Rome. And Rome must be the one ultimately that passes a death sentence that can be legitimately carried out. And so we kind of see a progression of the way that the Jewish people were, the ones who were against Christianity. We see it kind of progress, because at this point, the Jewish leaders knew they couldn't do anything to Jesus as far as putting him to death without Rome's consent. But by the time we get to Stephen, things have escalated to the point that they didn't get Rome's permission to stone Stephen. They stoned him, laying their coats at a young man's feet whose name was Saul. And then not long after that, we see that Saul has letters from the chief priests and authority there in Jerusalem to bring people bound, to go out into the other synagogues and places and bring them bound. And again, the violence towards Jesus' disciples begins to escalate as we see James, the brother of John, was beheaded. Peter was in line for that, but the angel of God released him. And so as we look here, and here comes some of the inconsistencies. There is and has been many studies about the inconsistency of what happened here. Some have just out and out referred to this as a kangaroo court. Part of the Jewish custom, of course, was that any type of judgment or trials were supposed to take place in the day. They were not supposed to take place at night because, again, that sort of reeks of conspiracy. People are in bed asleep and we're doing something. It ought to be public. People ought to be able to witness, and we ought to have access to witnesses both, again, for and against whatever's going on. So we've already had all this going on all night, and so that in and of itself was not what I'll just say kosher among the Jewish people. This is an exception. We see that they lead him away to Pilate, but Notice it says they led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and that's Pilate's hall of judgment, and it was early. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Now, it is clear at this point that the Passover has not taken place. I know there are many Christians who believe that the Last Supper was a Passover Seder type of supper, but they are still concerned about being able to eat the Passover. The judgment hall belonged to the Romans and was under Roman authority, which made that Gentile. It made it of the nations, and therefore as Gentiles they were unclean. And so these soldiers and those who were in charge of Jesus refused to take him into the judgment hall, but they made the Romans come out and get him because they didn't want to go in there because they would be defiled and then they wouldn't be able to eat the Passover. And here we see some of the great contradictions. We have these people who are so holy that they're concerned about being able to eat the Passover and so careful not to get defiled, while at the same time they're plotting and planning a man's murder. These are some of the great controversies that come out of all of this. They are so holy that they can't possibly take the money Judas gave them back because it's blood money, but you've got to ask yourself, where did they get the money to start with to give to Judas? And when they gave it to him, wasn't that blood money? Wasn't using their money to become blood money? They were buying really the death of Jesus, the betrayal of Jesus, but they're so holy that it's okay to take the money out of their pocket and use it for that, but once the person has accepted it, we can't take it back. That would be, that would just be against all our faith to do that. So there's a great deal of controversy in the middle of all of this, contradictions back and forth. And again, what we see here is the general way in which a lot of people operate, and that is, whatever I want to do, it's okay for me, and I make up my own rules. But if I decide it's not okay for you, then it's, if you do it, it's wrong. If I do it, it's okay, and I'll figure out a way to justify that. So that's the way it was with the Jewish leaders. They were manipulating the system while at the same time trying to present themselves as some kind of holy people who were distanced and apart from all the uncleanness and the sins and the defilements of the world. And so in verse 29, it says, Pilate then went out unto them and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? I'm surprised that the the Romans put up with the Jewish nation as long as they did. That they tried to appease them, they tried to deal with them. And here is another example. Pilate has to come out to them. If you have business with a person who is a government official, again, you come before him, you go into his judgment hall, but again, he is not unfamiliar with their customs and traditions and their views of him. I don't know how you would feel knowing that these individuals consider you to be an unclean thing. But Pilate nonetheless has to come to them to ask them what exactly it is that they want. And of course, they have a prisoner, and it's still relatively early in the morning. And so he asked them, What accusation bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee. That's not the same thing as a charge. Their answer, again, you could almost, their answer to Pilate is about the same kind of answer that Jesus gave the high priest. And of course, the soldier would reach over and smack Jesus for answering that. And, I can almost see that there should have been a Roman soldier there who smacked the Jew across the mouth for talking to Pilate that way. Because they really didn't give him an answer. They just basically said, if he wasn't a guilty person, if he wasn't somebody who deserves to be punished, we most certainly would not be bringing him here. And of course, that implies that that's an insult, really, in a way. It's one of those back-ended insults, but we wouldn't come before some unclean Gentile governor in the midst of our holy season if it wasn't important. So again, it's not exactly a compliment to Pilate, the answer that they give. And again, if Pilate didn't have at least some restraint, he might have, done more than what we see going on here. But I'm sure he was used to being insulted by the Jews, and of course he was interested in trying to keep peace among them. And so then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. And there's the gist of it. We have to do this. We need to get him put to death. There was a sense of urgency because the day's coming, and his disciples will be rounding up people in the city before long. And so again, they say that he's worthy of death, but again, we are forbidden from judging him or carrying that out, and that's your fault. Again, the Romans prohibited them from putting their prisoners to death. It had to be under the authority of Rome. Our time is up for this morning, and we're going to get into some of the judgment of Jesus before the Jews. Yes?
They sound like hypocrites. What about all them our kids when Jesus was born? They put to death.
Yeah. It's from Jesus' birth. You're right, from his birth even to his death. People were after him and attacking him, and the slaying of the infants at Bethlehem, and and the same. Again, the Jewish leaders. They do what they want to do when they want to do it, and that's fine for them. But again, if they are in support of something that's the same thing with someone else, then that's okay. So you're right, there is a great deal of hypocrisy in all of this. The pretense of being holy, while at the same time being literally in the depths of sin. So Lord willing, we'll pick up there next Sunday morning. Thank you.
Why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.